opening the center to foster dynamic piece activity and eyeing key central squares. Preparing for a fianchetto or a king's Indian setup, this pawn advance opens avenues for piece development while embracing a more flexible, less direct central challenge. Asserting central space aggressively, this pawn challenges black's d6 and opens lines for pieces. Developing the knight here pressures white's center, preparing for a fight for central control. Developing a knight to c3 now bolsters the center and prepares for potential attacking ideas, but also allows black to develop freely. Preparing a fianchetto, black aims to control the long diagonal and bolster the king's safety, though it might invite pressure on the d6 pawn. Safeguarding the central pawn advance, this knight now prepares to challenge black's fianchettoed bishop's influence. Developing the bishop to its natural outpost immediately addresses the pawn chain and prepares castling, a fundamentally sound concept. Developing the bishop here prepares for castling, reinforcing the center's pawn structure while keeping options open. Consolidating the knights establishes a solid central pawn structure and prepares for a potential queenside expansion. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount. Now your king can retreat to the secure corner, preparing to launch central and queenside counterplay. Solidifying the king's sanctuary offers immediate security, a prudent step given the central pawn structure and the potential for rapid developments. Advancing the e-pawn boldly seizes central space, aiming to disrupt black's knight development and potentially opening lines for the white queen and bishop. This creates immediate tension, forcing black to make a decision about how to react to this encroaching pawn and its implications for their kingside pawn structure. Embracing the center's open space now allows your pieces a freer flow, though be mindful of your king's safety as the pawn chain dissolves. Opening the d-file for your rook now presents a direct confrontation, creating immediate tension and forcing black to react to the suddenly exposed center. Initiating a pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's central control and open lines towards the king, this energetic maneuver aims to exploit the slight immobility of the pinned knight on c3 and create immediate tactical complications. The knight's bold sortie to g4, while seemingly aggressive, strategically forces white to consider defensive measures and potentially weakens their pawn structure should they decide to capture. It's a gamble, seeking to leverage activity for positional concessions. Shattering black's central pawn structure, this aggressive push creates immediate positional discomfort and opens lines for white's attack, potentially isolating the black king on the queenside and forcing difficult pawn decisions. Instantly challenging the central pawn advances, the knight leaps into a more active role, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities by harassing the f3 knight and e5 pawn. Disrupting the knight's central ambition, the queen trade liberates the rook and paves the way for a queenside pawn advance, aiming to seize territory and stifle black's development by forcing further exchanges. Clearing the d-file is paramount, opening crucial pathways for your remaining pieces to challenge white's central pawn majority and threatening to disrupt their developing harmony. Seizing the central light squares and opening a diagonal for the queen is the immediate consequence of this knight exchange, potentially leading to a more active piece play for white in the ensuing middle game. Reclaiming the central pawn with the knight immediately challenges the advanced white pawn and aims to solidify black's pawn structure. This action is a direct riposte to white's aggressive pawn push, seeking to untangle black's pieces and restore a more balanced position after the forced exchanges. Seeking to disrupt black's solid pawn structure and gain an outpost for the knight, white aims to occupy the crucial c7 square, potentially forcing weaknesses or creating tactical opportunities on the queen side. This pawn push disrupts the knight's central foothold, aiming to exploit the now undefended d7 square and potentially create a queenside pawn majority, though it weakens black's pawn structure in the long run. Unleashing a knight's assault, this maneuver immediately targets the undefended rook on c8, forcing a critical decision and potentially disrupting black's harmonious piece development, while simultaneously eyeing further penetration into enemy territory. Retreating the rook to b8 strategically opens the b-file for counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's knight's influence and potentially exploit any structural weaknesses that might arise from white's pawn push on the kingside. Targeting the advanced knight and bolstering central control, this pawn thrust creates immediate pressure and prepares to contest the open files, potentially simplifying into a favorable endgame where white's pawns will hold sway. A bold re-entry into the fray, the knight ventures into a seemingly exposed outpost, seeking disruption amidst white's consolidated pawn structure. This aggressive placement might aim to provoke weaknesses or create tactical chances, though it also presents a clear target for immediate counteraction. The knight's presence here could be a gambit, sacrificing immediate safety for potential initiative. Dislodging that active knight from its advanced post on g4 is a sensible priority, freeing up the f-pawn to advance and gain more central influence. Seeking counterplay and initiating a direct challenge to the white king's protective structure, black's bishop boldly advances to the center, forcing a critical decision for white. Preserving the king's safety becomes paramount after black's forcing check, repositioning white's monarch to a less exposed square, preparing for potential kingside action while avoiding immediate tactical threats. Black wisely repositions the bishop, clearing the way for the rook on d8 to potentially become more active and aiming to create diagonal threats against white's weakened kingside pawn structure after white's recent f4 advance. Injecting aggressive intent, the pawn lunges forward, challenging the bishop's current guard and initiating a critical battle for central territory. Black liberates the pinned knight and offers a trade of minor pieces, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and open lines for counterplay. This exchange, while simplifying, also allows white to consolidate their advantage on the d-file. The knight on g4 is no longer a significant threat, and black must now focus on activating their remaining pieces and contesting white's control of the open central files. The pawn push f4 has created some weaknesses in white's kingside, but black's immediate priority is to develop a cohesive attack rather than exploit those potential vulnerabilities. Exploiting the opened file, white decisively seizes control of the critical 7th rank, aiming to dismantle black's defensive structure and isolate the weak pawn on g6. Reclaiming material is a natural impulse, but this capture on g6 fundamentally alters black's pawn structure, creating permanent weaknesses that will be exploited in the coming exchanges. A bold repositioning of the bishop, aiming to neutralize black's key defender and potentially prepare a queenside advance, even if it momentarily vacates the central files and risks a slightly exposed king. Unleashing the bishop to the active e5 square, black aims to contest white's imposing pawn chain and potentially disrupt their central control. This square offers the bishop good scope and eyes the weakened dark squares around white's king. The rook arrives on the d-file, aiming to exploit white's central pawn structure, which is somewhat compromised after the pawn push and exchanges. This centralizing maneuver prepares for potential action against the d6 pawn or pressure along the open file, potentially creating a dynamic imbalance that black will need to carefully navigate. The rook's journey to the queenside, en passant asterisk, highlights a shift towards activating dormant pieces. This maneuver, aimed at creating downstream pressure, seeks to unbalance white's currently consolidated position. It's a subtle attempt to disrupt the rhythm, forcing white to reconsider their own piece placement in light of this newfound queenside mobility. Re-establishing control over the open file after the exchange of queens and rooks is paramount, and this relocation of your remaining rook to the central file decisively asserts your presence, preparing for potential advances or maneuvers down the rank. Reclaiming active piece placement on the d-file becomes paramount, as black aims to develop dormant pieces like the remaining knight towards central squares and potentially contest the open file. Elevating the rook to the first rank solidifies control over the open file, preparing to press the advantage against black's potentially exposed kingside and creating possibilities for a decisive breakthrough.